Chapter 15 in our text is a discussion of society and economy under the old regime in the 18th century. During the 18th century, people, especially nobles and to some extent peasants, were trying in the ancient regime, in the old regime, to try to maintain their hierarchy and their privilege. The peasants less successfully so, but the nobles certainly were. The 18th century was the great age of aristocracy, as your textbook says. The nobility is about 1 to 5% of the population of any country, but it was also the most wealthy, powerful, and influential segment of society. It has the most social, political, and economic power and sets the tone for what was considered polite society. There are various kinds of aristocratic privilege on 371. They do have any number of families, and they have control of the electoral system. They have seats in the House of Commons and certainly the House of Lords in the British Parliament. Nobles own about 1/4 of all arable land in England, anyways, and they also invest their wealth in a variety of projects like urban real estate, mines, canals, industrial ventures, and so forth. And the French nobles, of course, about 400,000 people were divided into the nobles of the sword, which were people who had been given a title because of their military service to the king, and the nobles of the robe, which, serving through the bureaucracy or purchasing their titles, or, also, of course, being in the church hierarchy. So the French nobles were different in rank, origin, and wealth somewhat, but they all have these hereditary privileges, which they are in some ways losing in this period. This will set the stage for a big clash in the future. East European nobles, too, to some degree. But the important theme in chapter 15 is on page 372, and that's the aristocratic resurgence. That's the 18th century resurgence of nobles. They try to, through parliaments primarily, but through other ways, maintain their exclusiveness of their rank, of their privilege. They close ranks and make it difficult for new people to get noble titles, and even don't accept them if they do in some cases. They want to reserve powerful posts in the state and military to the noble class alone, and also, of course, agitating against taxation. So the aristocratic resurgence is the nobility's reaction to the threat to their social position and privileges that they feel from the expanding power of the monarchies, but to some extent also from these new commercial trading classes, the new wealthy and things like this. So they use institutions like the parliaments primarily, but others too, to try to maintain their special privilege. As far as the peasants and serfs go, they have their own obligations, but remember, feudalism is dying in this period, so increasingly the peasants are left on their own. There are a series of peasant rebellions all over the place in Russia and Austria, Bohemia, Transylvania, Moravia, and other places like that. Bohemia and Moravia, of course, later become Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, and then the Slovak Republic too. But also very, very few revolts in Western Europe, but there were rural riots in England, and they're going to be in France around the time of the Revolution. Now, these are conservative in nature because the peasants are rebelling because they are losing their traditional or customary rights as the mobility closes ranks and as they try to stop, putting out money for peasants and things like this, kind of leaving them on their own. In the European world in this era, the family economy was what most people relied upon. Cottage industry, and women were certainly part of that. There was not the very strict separation between public spheres and domestic spheres, the work world and the home world, housework only and things like that. Women did tend to work side by side with their husbands in shops and on farms and things like this, and children certainly too. Of course, wealthier women, and especially upper class women, were much more kept apart from the men. So the domestic sphere is pretty much the preserve of the upper classes. Later, as we see with the spread of the industrial factory economy, we will see an implementation of the separate spheres in the middle class, and then, of course, eventually somewhat in the working class too. The class, the setting of the stage of manners and things and expectations by wealthier people will certainly always, be a factor. But in this period, most of the world, most people in the world live in an agricultural economy. And so there's a discussion on 376 about the revolution in agriculture, that during the 18th century, bread prices rise, population growth is happening, prices rise faster than urban wages are keeping up. And landlords in Western Europe also began a agricultural revolution, which is a series of innovations that challenged traditional peasant ways of destruction. Also, of course, the fencing off of the commons and the converting of all land for profit, for private usage. That was a huge part of the English Civil War, and it's going to be in other places. There was also an application of technology and science to agriculture. The seed drill invented by Jethro Tull, crop rotation, ways to restore nutrients to the soil and to supply animal fodder, meaning more livestock could be raised, and also an attempt to maximize the agricultural production of the land then being, arable land being used then, with the application of fertilizer and things like this. And the application of technology also means that there is a lessening of agricultural labor. So many farm hands are displaced by machine technology and by new methods and things like this. So that means that there are these rootless people straining the social fabric, straining the relations. A lot of these people, of course, are going to become the rootless, landless people who will become the first factory workers in the English Industrial Revolution. And England, of course, is the first place to have an industrial revolution for a variety of reasons that we'll look at in the second part of the chapter. But there are also the influx of New World foods, the corn and potato from the New World. Alone, of course, when the Spanish and the English and French and stuff go over there, causes a population explosion and also a decline in the death rate, because these New World foods, especially the corn and potato, are more hardy. They are not as difficult to raise as wheat, which the European diet had depended on for so long, and these foods can be stored. So this means that there is a population explosion. There's a demand for new goods, new foods, new jobs, new services, a new pool of labor. National modes of production and living have to be revised. I'm on page 378. There's also an increase in migration, earlier marriage, a decrease in the death rate, an increase in the birth rate and population overall. So this sets the stage for the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, which starts on 379, talking about how that, in the first industry, the first important one is textiles, with the application of water power and steam power and coal-fired power. These great spinning looms in England happened to take this cotton from North America, from the New World, and to spin it into thread, spin the thread into cloth to make cheap and durable clothing for people. Before then, most people wore wool clothes. You can't wash wool clothes in water. They fall apart. It was very common for women before the Industrial Revolution to have one or two dresses that they would wear up to 20, 30, 40 years and never wash once, because they were not durable enough. Cotton cloth is very light, it's very durable, and you can wash it many times before it falls apart. So cotton becomes something important, and that's why the Industrial Revolution focuses on textiles first, because people need cheap clothing, simply enough. There are, along with this, new methods of marketing, changing styles, advertising, more disposable income. A lot of things happen because of the Industrial Revolution. Tea and coffee become staples. That's on page 382. So there's a discussion there about the ways that textile was produced. And first you had the cottage industry, the domestic or putting out system of textile production. Later on, of course, it is going to all be consolidated under one roof in the factories. And this causes a large amount of changes for people in Europe, which I'm going to save for the next lecture, because it's something it takes a little while to get into. So I want to go back and talk about the Industrial Revolution just a little bit in the context of chapter 16. But first of all, of course, this does change life quite a bit, because in this era, more people are coming into urban areas, cities are growing. It causes some change too, but some of the people who don't change a lot in Europe during this period is the Jewish population. There's a discussion about the Jewish population on page 389 to 390. And it's important to note that in this period, outside of the Ottoman Empire, where they were tolerated, Jews were really discriminated against. There was a lot of violence against them, a lot of strange beliefs about things that the Jews did, and they were mostly limited to ghettos. That's where the word comes from. They were forced to live beyond the Christian settlements, and they were not allowed to have most jobs. They were not allowed to mix with the European population. So it's going to take a while before Jews are ever seen as anything even approaching citizens in these countries. Outside of the Ottoman Empire, Jews were frequently attacked and harassed and even killed. And in Western and Eastern Europe, both, you have these large-scale ghettos. So once again, we're going to talk about the changes in European society in the Industrial Revolution in the context of the next chapter in your textbook, chapter 16. I will post a lecture on that later this week.